Chapter 2. Man's Several Minds. To maintain a group's interest in an organism of ideas, to bring something for discussion every week, to guide people through their private confusions, stupidities, and difficulties for over a quarter of a century was no mean achievement, and that is what Ouspensky did for his followers, and we, for the most part, gave him our staunch support. We were a motley crowd held together almost entirely by the teaching. There were also people who came and went, the floating population of the work. There were its beachcombers who wandered about on the edge of things, picking up odd trifles, but making no real efforts. There was the stranger who would turn up for a single meeting and then, not getting the answer he required of Ouspensky, would come no more. And there were visitors who were already encumbered with so much mental and emotional luggage in the way of immovable convictions, theories, and firm beliefs that it was quite impossible for them to find room for anything new. There were all these and many other types of people who came to a few of Ouspensky's meetings, manifested signs of disapproval, and then disappeared for good. But all the time there remained a solid core of followers who rarely missed a meeting. Ouspensky was holding his meetings at the time at which I joined his group in a house in Warwick Gardens. In the large ground floor room in which we met, there was a blackboard, some 40 straight-backed, hard-seated wooden chairs, and a small table on which had been placed a carafe of water, a tumbler, a brass ashtray, a duster, and a box of colored chalks. At the table sat Ouspensky, a thick-set man with closely cropped gray hair, a man whom, judging by appearances, I should have taken to be a scientist, a lawyer, or a schoolmaster, but certainly not the exponent of what I understood to be a mystical form of philosophy. At first, I found him very difficult to understand, chiefly because he spoke with such a marked Russian intonation that I had the impression that I was listening to a foreign tongue. But very soon I became accustomed to his Slavonic diction and discovered, to my surprise, that he possessed a very large English vocabulary. When talking to us, he made little use of gestures or of the other aids employed by experienced lecturers, and this absence of art seemed to add weight to his statements. One felt that he had no desire to persuade one, as indeed he had not, and that what he said was sincere, reliable, and likely to be true. The bare room, the blackboard, duster, and chalks, the hard chairs, Ouspensky's appearance, the way he peered at his notes through and sometimes over his strong glasses, his dogmatic statements, his let's have no nonsense manner of conducting his meetings, and his curt dismissal of many questions as too long or useless, all these things transported me straight back to the schoolroom. I was a small boy again, listening to a kindly but rather severe headmaster delivering a talk to one of the lower forms. And although I was associated with Ouspensky for nearly a quarter of a century, our relationship remained as it had begun, that of a pupil, a perfect perhaps in later years, and his headmaster. I was never completely at my ease with him, and I never met or talked with him as one human should meet and talk with another human being, openly and without fear. Nevertheless, I am deeply conscious of indebtedness to him, and feel that I owe to him almost as much as I owe to Gurdjieff, for without Ouspensky's help, I doubt whether I should ever have understood Gurdjieff. Not that I claim even now to understand fully that truly astonishing man. Ouspensky's starting point for the study of G's system, he always referred to his teacher in this way, was that which G himself had selected as a starting point in Moscow, namely, the study of the nature of man. He was, as his text, the words usually ascribed to Socrates, but which are actually much older than the age of Socrates, the statement that self-knowledge is the beginning of all wisdom. He then went on to say that we had an immense amount to learn concerning ourselves, for it was a subject about which everybody was abysmally ignorant. We were, in fact, very different from what we imagined ourselves to be, and attributed to ourselves all sorts of qualities, such as inner unity, control, and will, which we did not, in fact, possess. Our work must begin, therefore, with giving up the idea that we knew ourselves, and with discovering what we were really like. This was a necessary preliminary to becoming something else if, after knowing ourselves a little better, we disliked something of the things we had seen and wanted to change them. Then, without any more introductory remarks, or conditional clauses, or mention of extenuating circumstances, Ouspensky plunged abruptly into G's system of thought. Man, he said, is a machine which reacts blindly to external forces, and, this being so, he has no will and very little control of himself, if any at all. What we have to study, therefore, is not psychology, for that applies only to a developed man, but mechanics. Ouspensky said that he would begin the study of man, the machine, with an investigation of his mind, and G's teaching on this subject differed from all other Western teachings. It proclaimed that man possessed not just one mind, but 7 different kinds of mind, each of which could make its contribution to the sum total of his knowledge. The first of these minds of man was his intellectual mind, an instrument which was occupied with constructing theories and with comparing one thing with another. Man's second mind was his emotional mind, which was concerned with feelings instead of with ideas. His third mind was the mind controlling his movements. And to his fourth mind, G had given the name instinctive mind. The fourth mind supervised all the physiological functions of his body, such as the processes of digestion and respiration. There was also the mind of man's sex life, and in addition to these ordinary minds, 2 higher varieties of mind, the higher emotional and the higher intellectual. These higher minds did not work in ordinary people like ourselves, but were active only in fully developed men. Yet they existed in ordinary people, and sometimes, though through some accident, for a moment or two became active in them. See figure 1. I'm going to briefly explain it. There's the intellectual center, the higher intellectual center, the emotional center, the higher emotional center, sex center, instinctive center, moving center. And back to the text. The members of Ouspensky's audience, who had been brought up on the Cartesian idea that the mind was a kind of ghostly presence that made use of the central nervous system, much as a householder uses a telephone, that is to say, as an instrument for receiving messages from the outside world and for issuing orders to the body, found this idea that the body possessed so many minds a little confusing. I personally was not of the Cartesian persuasion, and I was particularly interested in the idea that there existed a special mind for coordinating the various physiological processes in the body. For how, otherwise than by attributing to the body in its own native intelligence, was it possible to explain the marvelous work the body did, the complicated chemical processes which it carried out so rapidly in its laboratories, the astonishing cleverness it displayed in the regulation of its growth, the wonderful way in which it accomplished its own repair work, and the promptness with which it mobilized its defenses against the attack of hostile microorganisms. These physiological marvels had always astonished me, and they suggested very strongly that intelligence resided not only in the brain, but in the living tissues of the body. Philosophically speaking, I had already come to the conclusion that mind and body had to be regarded as coexistent and interdependent, each being a condition of the other's existence, and, as will later be seen, this philosophy is in harmony with G's teaching on this subject. I accepted very readily, therefore, this preliminary report that there there were several kinds of mind in man, and that the body possessed its own physiological variety of it. Ouspensky made free use of the diagram when teaching us, and a diagram which was frequently drawn on the blackboard was the one showing man's several minds, as in figure 1. He said that in this diagram, man was regarded as a three-storied being, in the top story of which there resided the intellectual mind, or, as Ouspensky now preferred to call it, the intellectual center. In the middle story was man's emotional mind, or center, and in the lower story, both his moving and his instinctive minds, or centers. When asked where, anatomically speaking, these minds or coordinating centers of man were situated, he answered that they were widespread throughout the whole body, but that the maximum concentration of the intellectual center, or what could be called its center of gravity, lay in the head. The center of gravity of the emotional center was in the solar plexus, that of the moving center in the spinal cord, and that of the instinctive center within the abdomen. Ouspensky advised that those of us who found this widespread diffusion of the various centers difficult to visualize should think of man's minds in terms of functions or activities rather than in terms of centers and anatomical structures. Instead of talking about the 4 lower centers, they could say that there were 4 different functions in a man, those of thinking, feeling, and moving, and that of regulating the various physiological needs of his body. In addition to these, there were the sexual functions and the functions of higher thought and higher feeling, which were only latent in us and unable to manifest themselves. According to G, all living creatures on the earth could be classified in accordance with the number of minds or centers which they possessed, and man was the only creature on this planet equipped with an intellectual center. The higher animals possessed emotional, moving, instinctive, and sexual centers, but such lowly things as worms were devoid even of emotional centers and managed to get along with moving and instinctive centers only. The relative activity of the 3 chief centers in man, intellectual, emotional, and moving instinctive, were different in different individuals, and this provided us with a means of classifying men under 3 or 4 headings. There were men who did everything by imitating the behavior of those around them, and who thought, felt, and moved and reacted much as everybody else thought, felt, moved, and reacted. Such people were controlled almost entirely by their moving center, which possessed a special gift for imitation, and a man of this type would henceforth be referred to as man number 1. There were other people in whose lives the emotions played a leading part, people who were guided by what they felt and what they liked and disliked rather than by what they thought. Such people spent their lives in seeking what was pleasant and in avoiding what was unpleasant. But sometimes they reacted pathologically in the reverse way, extracting a perverted pleasure from fear and suffering and converting what was distressing into a horrid form of voluptuousness. An emotionally controlled person of this kind would be spoken of in future as man number 2. Finally, there was man number 3, the man who was swayed by theories and by what he called his reason, a man whose knowledge was based on logical thinking and who understood everything in a literal sense. A man of this third kind would be called man number 3. Ouspensky made it clear to us that no one of these 3 types of men was superior to any other one, and that all 3 stood together on the same level, equally at the mercy of their physiological machinery and without any will. All that this classification was meant to show us was that the individual behavior and decisions of one kind of man could often be explained by the predominance in him of one kind of function, and the behavior and decisions of another kind of man by the predominance in him of another kind of function. This method of classifying people was possible because human development was usually lopsided, and it was much less serviceable when a man's development had proceeded in a more balanced way. A properly balanced man, working as he should work, resembled a well-trained orchestra, in which one kind of instrument took the lead at one moment of the performance, and another instrument at another. each making its contribution to the symphony being played. Unfortunately, it rarely happened that our centers worked harmoniously, for not only was one center liable to interfere with the work of another center, but it often attempted to do the work of another center. There were occasions, for example, when our actions should be based on feeling rather than on thought, and other occasions when feeling should yield precedence to thought. But arguments often replaced feeling in the first instance, and emotions were liable to interfere with thought in the second instance. As the result of these disagreements between centers and of the absence of any conductor of the orchestra, discords were frequently sounded, our feelings contradicting our thoughts, and our actions being at loggerheads with both our thoughts and our feelings. We resembled, therefore, orchestras which not only lacked conductors, but which were composed of musicians who had quarreled with one another. The players of the stringed instrument were no longer on speaking terms with the players of the wind instruments, and nobody in the least cared what the rest of the orchestra was doing. In short, each member of it did what he deemed to be right in his own eyes without any regard for anybody else. Ouspensky said that to know oneself meant many years of self-study, and that we must first understand the correct way of doing this. He explained that he had started by giving us G's account of the different centers because we should find it of use to us in the work we were about to undertake, that of self-observation. What was now required of us was that we should begin to observe the working of the various centers in ourselves as they were functioning, and should assign to the appropriate center each activity as we saw it. By obtaining our own examples of the working of these centers within ourselves, we should become more and more familiar with the working of our machinery. As G had long ago remarked, the study of man began with the study of mechanics and not of psychology, for psychology was applicable only to more fully developed people. To know ourselves in the way in which it was necessary for us eventually to know ourselves was a very ambitious aim, which could only be realized after many years of patient and painstaking self-study. He warned us against confusing self-observation as it should be carried out with that highly unprofitable occupation known by the term introspection. Introspection was very different from self-observation. What was required of us was that we should register or take note of our thoughts, emotions, and sensations at the moment of their occurrence. And introspection usually meant only thinking and dreaming about ourselves. Introspection also entailed analysis and speculation about the motives behind our behavior. But as our pictures of ourselves were to a great extent imaginary pictures, all this speculating and probing about in the darkness was of very little profit to anybody, so far as real self-knowledge was concerned. In observing ourselves, we must look at ourselves with detachment, and as though we were looking at another person about whom we knew very little. At first, we might find difficulty in assigning our activities to the right centers, but with experience, this would gradually become easier. For example, at first, some of us would confuse thinking and feeling and sensing, and it would be helpful to us to remember that intellectual center worked by comparing one thing with another thing, and by making subsequent statements on the basis of this comparison, whereas emotional center worked by recording its native likes and dislikes and acting directly on this basis. Instinctive center was similarly occupied with deciding whether the sensations it was receiving were of a pleasant or of an unpleasant nature. We should bear in mind the fact that neither emotional nor instinctive center ever argued or reasoned concerning anything, but because they perceived everything directly, they returned to the perception an equally direct response. We should look upon these psychic functions of ours as being different kinds of instrument, each variety of which made its characteristic contributions to the sum total of our knowledge. There were different ways of knowing a thing, and to know it completely was to know it simultaneously with our thinking, our emotional, and even our moving and instinctive minds. Ouspensky warned us that whilst studying ourselves in the manner we should come across many things which we disliked in ourselves, as well as many things of which we approved. But for the time being, we must be content only to note our likes and dislikes without attempting to bring about any change in ourselves. It would be a grave mistake, he said, and fortunately a mistake almost impossible to make, for us to alter anything in ourselves at this very early stage of our work. To change something in oneself without running the risk of losing something else of value required a knowledge of the whole which we were very far from possessing. In our present state of ignorance of the whole, we might struggle to get rid of some personal quality which, properly handled, might at a later date become an asset to us, or else we might strengthen some other feature in ourselves which we happen to admire, but which would be a hindrance to our further development. Moreover, if a man were able to destroy some feature in himself which he happened to dislike, he would at the same time alter the whole balance of his machinery, and thus bring about a number of unexpected changes in other parts of himself. It was fortunate, therefore, that it was beyond our present powers to tamper with ourselves, but possible only for us to see ourselves a little more clearly than we had formerly done. Ouspensky advised us to put all activities of a doubtful character aside until we had gained greater skill in the work of sorting them out. For the present, we should concentrate our attention on the classification of activities of a clear-cut nature. Then, after we had gained skill in observing the working of our various centers, we could begin the more difficult job of looking for examples of the wrong working of centers, due either to one center attempting to perform the work of another center, or else to one center interfering with the functioning of another center. He gave as examples of a center doing the work of another center, intellectual center pretending that it felt, whereas it was quite incapable of feeling anything, or emotional center coming to a decision which it was not within its province to make. He described the moving center as a very clever mimic, and said that it often imitated other centers working, making it appear outwardly that real thinking or feeling was going on, whereas in actual fact nothing of a genuine nature was happening at all. For example, a person might read out loud from a book or talk to somebody quite impressively, yet he might be only uttering words without any more meaning for him as he uttered them than the words spoken by a parrot had any meaning for the parrot. Reading, speaking, and so-called thinking on this very low level often occurred, and they were all imitations of other activities concocted by moving center. Ouspensky pointed out that the ability of one center to work for another could often be very useful, in that it allowed of continuity of action, but he warned us that if it occurred too often, it might become a habit and thus be harmful. There were occasions, for example, when clear thinking was of vital importance, and if at a particular moment of clearer thought, emotional center intervened through sheer force of habit and took it upon itself to pass judgment on a situation for which the reason was required, the result of its untimely interference would be extremely unsatisfactory. Man, he said, was a highly complicated and delicately adjusted piece of mechanism, and if the balance between the various parts of it were upset, the whole of the machinery began to work very badly. This sort of thing happens frequently in psychotic and neurotic individuals, that each center was continually interfering with the activity of another center, or else was attempting to do its work for it, and failing badly to accomplish it. As a result of all this interference and wrong functioning, everything in the machinery of the neurotic person was at sixes and sevens. But badly working machinery was by no means confined to the people we labeled neurotic. Uspensky said that although Western psychologists had recognized that wrong inner work and the interference of one's psychic function with another psychic function were responsible for many nervous diseases, they had not yet realized how much faulty work went on in ordinary and supposedly healthy people. Wrong work of centers occurred in us all. It accounted for the dullness of the sensory impressions we received from the outside world, for our apathy and lack of understanding, for our inability to see things vividly and directly as a child sees them, and for the general drabness of our lives. Man, continued Uspensky, is not only a machine, but a machine which works very much below the standard it would be capable of maintaining if it were working properly. It is necessary for us, therefore, to observe ourselves very closely, not only in order to obtain knowledge of our mechanism, but also in order that we may realize how much better our machinery might be made to work. There are many defects which are common to us all as ordinary human beings, and which are also forms of bad working which are peculiar to ourselves individually. In this preliminary stage of self-study, it is necessary that we should become thoroughly familiar with our own particular failings. As I have said earlier in this chapter, the idea that man has other minds than the single mind which the psychologists have linked with his brain and central nervous system made a strong appeal to me. Moreover, all that Uspensky was now saying about the ability of one center to take on the work of another center was fully in accord with my personal experience. I could recall how long ago, in learning to ride a bicycle, my moving center had, at a certain moment, taken over the work which had been performed up till then by my intellectual center. At the beginning of the lessons, an immense amount of thought had to be directed to the way in which body weight was distributed, and if my attention had been allowed to stray for a moment from this task of balancing myself and of turning the handlebars in the right direction, I promptly tumbled over. Then, quite suddenly, all this thinking and scheming became unnecessary, and I found myself riding a bicycle and balancing myself as though to the manner born. Something within me had suddenly assumed responsibility for the whole business of riding a bicycle, and the something which had relieved the head of its previous work was clearly my moving center. I could recall also the abrupt change which had taken place in my mode of speaking Spanish when I was living in Buenos Aires. Up till a certain dramatic moment, much thinking had been required for talking in Spanish, and what I had really been doing all the time was translating painfully from English into Spanish. Then, within the space of a week, a marked change occurred, and I found myself thinking and dreaming in Spanish. All need for translating had gone, and my moving center was mimicking everybody around me and doing much of the work previously performed by my intellectual center. Like other people, I had some difficulty at first in distinguishing between instinctive movements and movements carried out by my moving center, but Uspensky had helped us greatly by saying that instinctive movements were inborn, whilst moving center movements had to be learnt. For example, the newborn infant knew how to breathe from the very start and quickly learned to suck and to swallow, but the art of walking had to be acquired painfully at a later date. Uspensky also said that each center possessed its own form of memory, and I recalled the surprise which I had felt on discovering that, although I had not ridden a bicycle for over 20 years, I was still able to leap onto a machine and to pedal off without thought or difficulty. My moving center had remembered the technique of bicycle riding all that time. Bicycle riding also illustrated what Uspensky had said about one center interfering with another. If after moving center had taken over the responsibility for bicycle riding, one started to think about it and to work out intellectually how the weight should be distributed and in which direction the handlebars should be turned, one was likely to have a spill, and this was a clear instance of intellectual center interfering with moving center. There was an instinctive connection also between G's idea of memory in instinctive center and Samuel Butler's view that instinct in animals and even heredity as a whole are the result of inherited memories. Samuel Butler protested against what he called shearing the thread of life and hence of memory between one generation and its successor. According to him, our bodies inherit memories from a long line of ancestors, memories which are carried across the gap between successive generations by the ovum and the spermatozoon. He gave, as an example of inherited memory, the fact that at a certain stage of its development within the egg, the chick remembered that it had to tap with its beak on the inner side of the eggshell in order to break out into the world. Not only did the chick remember how to do this, but at a still earlier stage of its development, its instinctive center had recalled in time the need for developing certain very hard cells at the tip of its beak in order that it might be able to break the shell. And having remembered this, it had promptly proceeded to do what was required of it. Heredity therefore, was for Samuel Butler a manifestation of racial memory, a theory of his which had always fascinated me. And here was G supporting Samuel Butler by speaking of a memory, an instinctive center which regulated all physiological and growth processes. It was true that since the days of Weissman, scientists have been of the opinion that characteristics acquired by the parents are never handed down to the offspring, but I had always been skeptical of Weissman's arguments. At heart, I had always remained a heretic, a Lamarckian, and an admirer of Butler. I was surprised at the richness of the haul of observations I made during the next few weeks by observing myself in the way Ouspensky had advised, as though taking stock of some other person with whom I was only slightly acquainted. Perhaps the earliest and most disquieting of the findings made in this way was that I was never the same for more than a few minutes, and yet I had the effrontery to preface many of my remarks with such misleading phrases as, "I always think that," or "I am convinced that," or "I feel strongly that." What nonsense! I realize now that frequently I had thought and felt quite differently from the way in which I was thinking and feeling at that particular moment. And who was it that was making this dogmatic statement about his own thoughts and feelings? Who, in short, was I? Here was a problem of the first magnitude to be faced. Self-observation gave rise to a host of new questions. Over 2,000 years ago, Heraclitus proclaimed that everything flowed, and up till that moment I had imagined that in uttering these well-known words, he was referring only to the world outside ourselves. Now, as the result of only 3 months' self-observation, I realized that what was undoubtedly true of the world outside myself was equally true of the world within me. Everything flowed within me as it flowed without me. One inner state quickly followed another, a feeling of pleasure being quickly replaced by one of displeasure, so that, when I looked within, it seemed to me that my various emotions were playing a game of family coach, all changing places. A study of these two flowings, the inner and the outer, soon convinced me that the inner was of far greater importance to me than the outer, so far as the business of living was concerned. Yet it was the instability of the outer world that I always blamed whenever anything went wrong with my life, and never the instability within me. It was the same with other people. They were always struggling to alter things outside themselves, without ever realizing the much more urgent need to change the world within. All would be well if only A, B, and C would behave differently. If the law were altered, if people were not such fools, if certain things were done which ought to be done. But they never stopped for a moment to look within at the great current of life, partly conscious, but still more unconscious, which was carrying them along as an incoming tide sweeps in on its surface fragments of wreckage and seaweed. According to Freud, what we do, what we feel, and what we think are but the byproducts of those dark and dynamic regions of the mind in which lie all our primitive animal instincts. And Freud gives us quite a good account of the subconscious mind responsible for all these activities in us. But the best descriptions of this great underground river of desires, thoughts, and feelings are to be found in the much earlier works of the Cambridge Neoplatonists, written about a century ago. In 1866, E.S. Dallas gave the following dramatic description of the surge of life in the poorly lit caverns of the mind, in the dark recesses of memory, in unbidden suggestions, in trains of thought unwittingly pursued, in multiple waves and currents, all at once flashing and rushing, in dreams that cannot be laid, in the force of instinct. We have glimpses of a great tide of life ebbing and flowing, rippling and rolling and beating about where we cannot see it, quoted by Michael Roberts in The Modern Mind. No better description could be given of the force which carries us along with it, a force of life of whose existence I was now becoming dimly aware.